30 June 1941. A summer sultriness blanketed the endless plains of eastern Poland, and only the movement of the train swaying slightly beneath us brought us relief from the heat. The heavily laden transport rolled slowly through ragged pine forests and stretches of sandy, uncultivated land, and we passed tiny farms and villages and crossed meandering rivers on our way toward the east. Except for children who occasionally waved to us from the dusty streets and roadsides, we were ignored by the local inhabitants. The men and women in drab clothing whom we observed from a distance became lost in the shimmering heat as the wheels of the Reichsbahn put them farther behind us. We passed the hours sitting or lying under a cloudless sky as we rested on the open flatbed cars between tightly secured weapons and vehicles. In contrast to following the peacetime regulations that had previously dominated our lives, we were permitted to loosen the first button of our grey-green uniforms and roll back the sleeves for what little comfort we could enjoy in the sweltering heat. The initial news of the war with Russia was several days old, and we spoke little about the prospects of becoming involved in the fighting. Everyone was confident that this war against the Soviet Union, like the conflict with France and Poland, would pass quickly. At dawn, the walls and towers of Krakow, the holy city of Poland where the heart of Pilsudski lies within the cathedral, appeared. The transport slowly screeched to a halt beside a dusty rail-switching station, and within seconds we were ringed by a band of dishevelled children who were ignored by the stone-faced military police sentries standing nearby. "Bitte Bror, Herr," they cried plaintively, with dirty hands grasping eagerly for the morsels we passed to them from our bread bags. We were permitted to detrain, and the children descended on us. Poor Poland, I thought to myself. I passed a slice of bread to an enterprising young girl in return for a tattered newspaper. It had been printed the previous day in German and Polish, and it was possible to read the first news about the operation in the east, advance on Lemberg. Gridnov, Brest-Litovsk, Wilnow, Kovno and Dunaburg had quickly fallen into German hands. Ecstatic headlines announced that more than 2,582 Soviet aircraft and 1,297 Soviet tanks had been destroyed. Soviet-occupied Poland was being freed from the Bolshevik yoke. The military police soon sprang to action with whistles and shouts, gesturing for us to reboard our transport, and we piled back onto the train. The rail cars groaned in protest and strained against the weight, and we began to move slowly forward as I read the contents of the newspaper aloud to our gun crew, all of whom lay listlessly and disinterested on the flat rail car. I glanced up from my reading and gazed back on the rail platform, now occupied only by the ragged band of children, and our journey to an unknown destiny continued. On the 1st of July, we came to a stop 10 kilometres west of Pelkini near Yaroslav, where we dismounted and proceeded eastward, the infantry forming a long column on foot, the unenviable fate of every infantryman. Our anti-tank gun moved ahead of us in the distance, pulled by a Chenilette tracked vehicle captured during the French campaign. Our senses were immediately struck by the lingering smell of smoke and ashes, and soon we could observe the large craters and scorched vehicles that depicted the handiwork of the German Stuka dive bombers. We eventually filed to a halt at a temporary roadside canteen, where, under the watchful eyes of the ever-present military police, Swabian Red Cross nurses drew cold coffee from a horse-drawn field kitchen and ladled it into our outstretched canteen cups. In vain they asked questions about recent news from home. We proceeded in a long grey column, leaving the Red Cross nurses behind, and marched farther toward the east. As dusk settled on us, we located the vehicles and guns beneath the shelter of a small file of trees that sparsely lined the narrow road. Camouflage protection from aircraft was ordered, and we attempted to cover our position with thin branches. At dawn, we were overtaken by supply columns rolling along an arterial road, running toward the distant sunrise. We spent another day following in the tracks of the supply unit, and late in the afternoon we encountered the enemy for the first time. The dusty road was lined with endless columns of Russian prisoners in ragged khaki-brown uniforms, heading in the opposite direction. Many of those without caps wore wisps of straw or rags tied to their close-cropped heads as protection against the burning sun, and some were barefooted and half-dressed, giving us an indication of how quickly our attacking forces had overrun their positions. By their strange mixture of clothing, they appeared to us to be barely soldiers, representing a mixture of white Russians, dark-skinned Caucasians, Kyrgyzs, Uzbeks, nomads with Mongolian features, an influx of people from the two continents covered by Soviet Russia. They filed past us silently and with downcast eyes. Occasionally, several of them could be seen supporting another who appeared to be suffering from wounds, sickness, or exhaustion. In school, we had been taught that the Urals separated Europe from Asia. However, here we saw Asia in what we believed to be the heart of Europe. The long column of misery disappeared behind us, and as darkness descended, we came to a halt. Beneath a star-covered sky, we wrapped ourselves in camouflage-printed shelter quarters, not to awaken until dawn. The 14th Panzerjäger Company was assigned as the forward advance unit, and at precisely 5 o'clock we marched. The crumbling ruins of burned-out houses stood as mute witnesses to the fighting that the city of Yaroslav experienced during the Poland campaign, which, although only 2 years hence, seemed a lifetime ago. With the crossing of the San River at Radymo, we had Russian soil beneath our feet. We passed a large German cemetery from World War I with a faded wooden sign above the entrance, to the memory of those comrades who fell at Dubrovica. Our column was not permitted to stop long enough to examine the graves, and little did we realize how many cemeteries of our own would line the roadsides deep into Russia. We soon encountered fresh mounds of earth marked by rough birch crosses, topped with the unmistakable steel helmets of the German Wehrmacht. These first silent, bloody witnesses on the highway to the east were arranged in regulation rows and columns, and we attempted to divert our gaze but were always drawn back to the graves. We marched on without speaking, and the silent, red-brown mounds of earth seemed to beckon to us as if to say, "Do not leave us here. Do not abandon us in this strange place." Faint artillery fire could be heard from the direction of Lemberg. The condition of the roads became steadily worse, and dust settled thickly on the lancers, horses, and vehicles. Only the dim silhouette of the vehicle ahead of our platoon was visible as the sun stood like an orange globe in its zenith, barely penetrating the choking clouds of dust. Sweat and dirt combined to create bizarre shapes on the faces peering from beneath the heavy green helmets. Near Krakowice, we again combined shelter quarters to tent and spend the night. Our odyssey into the void continued as we advanced toward an unknown destination. We encountered primitive villages lining the road, and Russian women and children peered at us intently from the shadows of doorways, and gazed at us through the protection of rough-hewn window panes. The only men to be seen were ancient veterans of other wars. When asked, the people of the villages would tell us of the Bolsheviki. The menace and terror of the Siberian penal camps could be seen in the eyes of these people as they spoke, and they told us that pictures of Christ and Stalin hung in the schools. When the village teachers asked, "Whom do you thank for your daily bread?" the children would be compelled to answer, "Stalin." We were relieved that we were experiencing firsthand the effects of communism, and that what we were hearing could not simply be attributed to our own propaganda. Niedermeyer remarked, "After having seen Russia, we now know how fortunate we are to be German." On the 5th of July, we moved through Lemberg. The city had been heavily hit twice during the initial course of the war, and the early morning haze revealed burned-out factories, ruined homes, and destroyed tanks with greasy black smoke billowing from the still-hot carcasses. In one of the few partially intact sectors of the city, a long line of people waited in front of a bread depot. They stared at us with listless eyes as we passed. The Russian airbase at Lemberg had been rendered unusable by the Stukas. Blackened aircraft and smashed equipment were scattered throughout the area, and during a pause on our march, soldiers wandered among the wreckage, photographing one another alongside destroyed Soviet planes, and curiously picking through the ruins, ever mindful of strict regulations against looting or the non-authorized requisition of captured enemy equipment. The war with the Soviet Union being only a few days underway, we still observed anything associated with the Soviet army with curiosity. Our march continued through the first half of July. For days, great numbers of destroyed Russian tanks lined our path, and capsized prime movers with limbered field guns were scattered along the roadsides. In the fields, one could see numerous abandoned Russian artillery positions that appeared to be intact, indicating how quickly our offensive had overtaken the Soviet defenders. We were astonished at how well motorized the Soviet army was, as our own artillery was represented primarily by horse-drawn equipment reminiscent of World War I. The graves of German and Russian soldiers were now found to be close together, the German graves marked with rough-hewn wooden crosses to the right of the road, the Russians to the left. The Russian graves remained nameless, marked only with rifles and bayonets stuck into the fresh earth. The German graves were topped with the customary steel helmet, and from some of the crosses hung identification discs from linen string, waiting to be collected and filed. On the 8th of July, as we neared Brody on the wide, rutted road, we passed supply units and cable layers of the 71st Division of the 6th Army. The cable layers advised us that the division had taken Lemberg with 600 casualties, and confidently reported that the war was to end within several weeks. Our advance halted on the old Russian-Galician border. We expected to encounter strong enemy opposition when the 6th and 17th Armies reached the Stalin Line, a series of bunkers and heavily defended strongpoints. We were disappointed to learn that the 132d Infantry Division had received the assignment to remain in reserve, as most of us were eager to see action before the inevitable surrender of the Soviet Union. 14 July passed without notice. Our existence remained marked by boredom. Our environment consisted of 100-metre-wide transport roads, dust, mud, burning heat, thunderstorms, and an endless open space with only occasional clusters of sparse trees stretching to the horizon. Thatched roofed huts of the collective farms could be seen in the distance, and we concentrated on them, like palms in the desert, to guide us to primitive wells. We had received word that the wells were often poisoned by the Red Army in retreat. Skeletal remains of horses left a lingering stench along our path, the smell that would remind us forever of the Soviet paradise into which we found ourselves marching ever deeper. The advance slowed as we crossed through Jampol. Occasionally we were lucky enough to obtain a few onions and carrots from the villages that lined our path. More rarely a chicken or a couple of eggs served to augment the monotonous field rations. We reflected with longing on our time spent in Kärnten and Zagreb before the onslaught against the Russians began, as there we had enjoyed cold beer and Slibowitz. The infantry continued to march from sunrise to sunset. Dusty, sweaty, and clammy without relief from the brutal climate, we penetrated deeper into Soviet Russia. Although it was against regulations, small pannier carts pulled by stout Russian ponies were requisitioned to lighten the load of our field packs. As we left civilization as we knew it farther behind us, this habit became more commonplace. The sparse human habitation was primitive and probably lice-ridden, so nights were spent in tents, haystacks, or more often on the bare earth, sleeping rolled in the ever-useful shelter quarter that each Lanza was issued. Members of horse-drawn units would be awakened at dawn by the nuzzling of hungry and thirsty horses. We passed wood-framed schoolhouses, which were little more than rough halls decorated with the characteristic red stars and red-painted podiums for political gatherings of the Communist Party. Tattered, dusty pictures of Stalin and Lenin hung on the walls, and Stalin had introduced compulsory schooling, where previously, during the era of the Tsar, the alphabet was hardly known. We were surprised that many of the schoolchildren could speak some broken German, and from captured propaganda material, we learned that political education was a priority for the children. On the 17th of July, we received mail from home for the first time since our advance had begun, and 10 days later the division entered the Ukraine and marched over Kasatin in a southeast direction toward Rushin. The Ukraine steamed in the summer heat. Over wide, sandy roads and on pavement of rough stones, we came into a land of unending horizons. Endless wide steppes and grain and sunflower fields bordered our way toward the east. Primitive wooden windmills dotted the horizon, and we used them as our drink and rest stations during the lonely march through a land that left us with unforgettable impressions of freedom, contrasting with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. We came to a halt in an unkempt acacia grove that offered sparse shade in an ocean of grass. The company had marched 60 kilometres in less than 24 hours on painfully torn and bruised feet. Dusty and channeled with streaks of sweat, faces browned by wind and sun peered from under heavy helmets to observe our domain. Hands slippery with sweat gripped the entrenching tools to tear holes in the earth. The command was given: dig in. Stripped to the waist, we hacked at the earth without speaking, and nearby the singing of bees reminded me of their own endless toil. Clemens and Gare, the two tractor drivers, decided to locate the source of the bees in search of honey. Equipped with mess tins and armed with shelter quarters and gas masks as protection from bee stings, they disappeared behind the gun position into a collective farm. After an hour of labour, I had constructed to the left of the pack position a regulation earthwork, the high side facing our front, on which we would lay our rifles and grenades. The anti-tank gun stood well concealed with branches and grass near the edge of the grove. A sandy road cut through the open field before us in an east-west direction, and in the shimmering heat of the afternoon sun, the silhouettes of huts in a distant village were visible on the horizon. To the left of the road, Gefreiter Poel had placed his half-track to the rear of the position, to be hidden behind the acacia grove, and he set to work camouflaging his pack. Forward observers from the artillery and the mortar units moved ahead to their observation points, with rolls of communication cables strapped to their backs. Only the occasional clatter of an entrenching tool, canteen cup, or mess tin broke the stillness of a seemingly peaceful world. Folding my dusty tunic under my head for a pillow, I had just begun to doze in the afternoon sun when a rifle shot broke the afternoon silence. In one motion I rolled into the freshly dug foxhole, clapped on the heavy steel helmet, and brought my carbine to my shoulder. Staring forward, I could detect only emptiness and softly swaying grasses. During infantry defence drills, it had been hammered into us to shoot at every disturbance, every moving leaf and blade of grass, in order to kill the enemy. Now, with my heart pounding, thoughts raced through my mind. Would today be the day that I must kill another human being? Who shoots first? Who hits first? Him or me? Must I kill today in order to save my own life and the lives of my comrades? I pictured the rows of graves we had passed during our march with carefully placed crosses, identification markers hanging from them, and tried to shake them from my mind. About 600 metres to the left of our position, the racing sound of rifle fire broke the stillness. Sounding at first like the familiar popping of carbine fire at the training range, soon wild shots snapped through the air and ricocheted above us. With burning eyes, we continued staring forward, but we noticed nothing unusual before our position. Through the rifle fire, the distinctive crack of an anti-tank gun sounded far in the distance. Within a few minutes, the incident was over. Dust and the acrid smell of burnt cordite drifted faintly in the air, and to our left an ugly black cloud billowed into the blue afternoon sky. We remained crouched in our positions. In hushed tones and with hearts pounding with excitement, we tried to assess what had occurred. A short time later, we learned through a courier that Pohl's anti-tank gun had knocked out a Soviet armoured reconnaissance vehicle, and that an attack by a Russian rifle company had been repulsed. Little did we realize that in the months and years that lay before us, this short encounter would come to be considered as nothing more than a casual and insignificant brush with the enemy. And this first action of the regiment was little indication of the nightmarish years of fighting marked by deprivation, sorrow, and countless victims that lay before us. From this vast expanse, many of us would never return. But at the time, one didn't dwell on such thoughts. I turned to my diary, the small pocket-sized book bound in black oilcloth, the corners already ragged and the pages stained with sweat and rain, to recount the incident. The two drivers returned with mess tins dripping with honey, a satisfying addition to our evening rations. We ate the honey with the comice bread, welcoming the change from the usual ration of tinned liver and blood sausage, and we washed the bread and honey down with cold tea before preparing for another march at dawn. 30 July found us in bivouac at Mikhailovka. During the course of the previous days, some of the units had experienced attacks from Soviet bomber and fighter bomber squadrons, which had proven to be ineffective in slowing our advance. The rifle companies and horse-drawn units marched throughout the night and covered about 65 kilometres to reach Kargalik on the 31st of July. The nightly password was issued, and rumours circulated of a pending attack to take place the following morning at 7 o'clock along a wide front. We passed the summer night wrapped in shelter quarters as we crouched in our grass-lined foxholes. The rumours held true, as exactly at 7 o'clock, the 1st of August, we began our push forward toward the Soviet defences near Mirovka. An immense open field lay before us, and our view extended over the steppe, which offered little protection save a gently rolling terrain with shallow depressions invisible to the untrained eye. This presented a great advantage for the Soviets, for as defenders they were able to dig into the safety of the earth with a clear field of fire before their defences. We made final preparations to abandon our positions and to move across the open steppe. With little effort we brought the pack into position on the edge of a wheat field, which offered a wide field of fire facing eastward over the waving green sea, interrupted only by sparse potato gardens. The first rays of the morning sun danced across the wheat stalks of the Ukraine, and through the morning haze we could recognize the distant silhouettes of two villages on the horizon. We sat on the gun carriage drinking warm coffee in an attempt to dissipate the cold feeling within us. Everyone desired to appear nonchalant and spoke of things not associated with the war, attempting through conversation to conceal the anxiety clearly etched in sunburned faces. Company officers gathered in tight circles several dozen metres away, speaking in low tones and glancing toward the enemy positions, occasionally raising field glasses to their eyes. At 6 o'clock our artillery had opened fire. The heavy projectiles screamed over us en route to predetermined targets within the enemy positions, and the infantry, burdened with weapons, ammunition, communications equipment and explosives, began to advance along a broad front. The movements seemed to follow as planned in exacting detail, giving an initial impression that nothing had taken place other than another training exercise at Farkirchen or Dugoselo. The captured French tractor clattered noisily up to our position. Limbering our gun, we climbed aboard and advanced, leaving a rising cloud of dust in our wake. We passed the armoured reconnaissance vehicle knocked out by Poel on the previous day, and our eyes were drawn to the macabre and still unfamiliar scene of a half-burned corpse hanging with naked torso from one of the hatches. The two anti-tank guns of the platoon lurched forward over the undulating ground, accompanying the advance along the sandy road toward Kargalik. The machine guns of the foremost infantry units were already engaged. The audible bursts of the MG-34S floated back to us over the wheat stalks. Behind us, mortar tubes and artillery pieces pounded with dull thumping, in contrast to the high-pitched bursts of small arms fire. Suddenly, ricochets were whistling and bouncing among us, and we found ourselves scrambling for cover in the ruts and furrows of the road. "Take cover!" screamed Gun Captain Hartmann. Through the ever-increasing roar from weapons of every calibre, we could see his outstretched arms motioning and his lips moving. His commands remained drowned in the pounding thunder of weaponry. Finally, the moment had come. It was now our time to face the enemy. Despite the gnawing fear within us, we met the inevitable with profound relief, which served to demonstrate how our priorities had shifted since our march had begun. The gun crews automatically and mechanically set to work as they had done in drills countless times before. Gunners 1 and 2 loosened the limbers, locked the wheels. Gunners 3 and 4 spread the limbers wide apart, while the aimer simultaneously adjusted for range by depressing the barrel to a horizontal position. The loader opened the bolt to the breech, and the handlers tossed cases of ammunition from the carriage. With one motion, the first round was snapped into the open breech of the barrel to be smoothly loaded and locked, and the weapon was ready to fire. Hartmann knelt next to the gun with binoculars held to his eyes as he directed the aimer in textbook fashion. "Right end of the hedgerow, range 400, machine gun nest, fire!" Within seconds, one round after another was leaving the barrel in response to his practiced commands. We were able to observe an infantry platoon from the 5th Company as it became pinned in a shallow depression under heavy fire from enemy machine guns. Under cover fire of the pack, our rounds now struck directly within the enemy positions. The platoon worked its way forward. Clearly visible were the heavily laden infantrymen, advancing slowly through the wheat fields. Thin wisps of smoke revealed where the dry stalks had been ignited by tracer fire. The collective farm at Klein Kargalik, which was reportedly occupied by Soviet artillery observers, was taken under fire by the second pack at a range of some 600 metres. The straw-thatched huts of the collective began to burn brightly, with thick black smoke rising into the clear sky. We received the command to shift positions, and we advanced forward to the crossroads on the same bearing as the burning farm huts. Through the bursts of impacting mortar rounds and the pounding of machine gun fire, we were conscious of the cheers erupting from our parched throats as we observed the Russians abandoning their positions. As they attempted to flee from the farm along the dusty road toward the east, our machine gunners increased their fire, and again the rapid-firing MG-34 Spandaus sent streams of copper-jacketed rounds into the fleeing clusters of khaki-brown figures. To our right, the first prisoners appeared with upraised hands and eyes wide with fright. They were quickly stripped of helmets and combat equipment, and they instinctively hurried toward our rear at a trot, with hands clasped behind their heads. While changing positions, our tracked vehicle parted a tread. The chenillette spun in an untimely half-circle and stopped, helplessly stuck in an open field within sight of the enemy. The drivers bailed out of the vehicle and desperately began to attempt repairs as we unhitched the gun and slipped into towing harnesses to pull it forward. The pack, designated as number 1 within our company, left us behind as it advanced, bouncing along the rough road toward the sound of firing. Sweat soaked through the grey-green uniforms and left trails on faces covered with dust and grime as the Ukrainian summer sun beat upon the dull green helmets. Exhausted, we hung gasping and panting in the towing harness as rifle shots cracked in a now familiar tone and plucked at the crusted, dry road surface. Occasionally, tiny mushrooms of dust erupted in erratic lines along the road near us as bullets fired from a heavy machine gun situated on the east edge of Klein Kargalik impacted near us. With the protective armour shield facing forward, we again lunged against the harness to pull the gun farther, our faces strained with exertion and fear. An occasional ping rang sharply against the armour as a bullet struck it like a hammer, a deadly reminder that we were still under fire from isolated snipers. Hartmann ran forward to reconnoitre a suitable gun position, his submachine gun swinging from his neck and a hand grenade clenched in his right fist. He directed us toward the right and into the edge of a wheat field. As we left the road, we noticed a vague checkerboard pattern of fresh earth in the ruts where the Russians had blocked our advance route with their box-shaped mines. Hartmann's reconnaissance had prevented us from straying into them. We paused to catch our breath in the sparse shadow of the steel gun shield. No tree, bush or building was present to offer even faint relief from the burning midday sun. With heaving lungs, I fell on my hands and knees for a moment. Others collapsed into the furrows on the edge of the road in a vain attempt to find shade. Some merely stretched themselves on the Ukrainian earth. I remained vaguely aware of the bullets from the Maxim machine gun again cracking nearby, and the pounding of my heartbeat gradually slowed while I lay in the dirt. The deadly projectiles continued to snap and whine over us. The Russians attempted to zero in on our disabled vehicle now 100 metres distant from where our efforts had brought the gun. Fountains of earth were thrown skyward, and a thick cloud of grey smoke engulfed the chenillette as it was surrounded by impacting rounds. Despite the hail of small arms fire snapping through the air about them, the drivers escaped unscathed and were able to repair the track. Leaping into the driver's seat, Clemens slammed the transmission into gear, and with a racing engine the vehicle lurched forward and bounced over the open ground toward us. The other gun, 100 metres to our left, opened fire in an attempt to knock out the Maxim. It then moved forward, the tractor crawling down the left side of the road, until it turned sharply into an immense wheat field that stretched to the horizon. The machine gun continued to keep the tractor under fire, the small caliber ammunition having little effect on the steel-plated skin of the vehicle. We greeted the arrival of our driver and the tractor with mixed emotions. We were desperate to shift positions, and the prime mover could now pull the heavy gun. However, we were fully aware that the vehicle would draw additional fire from the enemy positions. The thought of abandoning the gun in order to find shelter from the enemy fire flashed through my mind, but I just as quickly eliminated the unthinkable option and strained harder against the harness. Within a few seconds that seemed to last an eternity, the gun was hitched and under tow by the tractor, the motor screaming in protest as the gun bounced behind us over the uneven ground. The Russians had pulled their artillery fire closer to their own lines, and the heavy projectiles of high explosives crept ever nearer to us, impacting among the most forward units. The incoming rounds shook the earth beneath us, and only with great effort could we hear the shouted commands above the explosions. The 7th Company, to the left of us, had become engaged in heavy fighting. As we advanced, the Russians began to scramble from their positions to flee through the wheat fields toward Kargalik, some 500 metres distant. Our forward machine gun crews fired their MG-34S while standing in the waist-high wheat, each barrel resting across the shoulder of a crewman in order to maintain a clear field of fire. A number of the Russians were struck by the bursts of machine gun fire and tumbled to the earth, disappearing among the wheat stalks. As we moved forward, we came under sporadic rifle fire from a group of Soviets who later surrendered, moving toward us with upraised arms, fear and exhaustion clearly etched in their faces. The day's objective, a railway embankment in front of the village, had been reached. 12 kilometres of territory were won in 6 hours of difficult fighting, and my thoughts dwelled on the insignificance of 12 kilometres. 12 kilometres, in an endless land where unbroken fields stretched to the horizon before us from sunrise to sunset. I wondered how many more 12-kilometre battles lay ahead of us during our march away from the setting sun. We came upon one of our casualties lying motionless in the dirt on the road, his helmet still secured tightly to his head, sightless eyes staring into the sky. Russian prisoners were quickly employed to carry the wounded to a field dressing station. Escorted by our lightly wounded, who marched along the edge of the road, the pitiful column wound toward the 2nd Battalion collection point to our rear. Thus the regiment experienced its first clash with the enemy, and we had suffered our first losses as well. With no joy of victory in our ranks, the feeling of excitement quickly drained away to be replaced by an overwhelming sadness and longing to leave this place. As yet, we had not experienced the true effects of prolonged warfare, which becomes an environment that sets aside all former bonds to family and culture and irretrievably replaces them with bonds to the comrade at your side. That was to come in the weeks, months, and years ahead. The journalists assigned to the propaganda company would write colourful reports on what had taken place, and would also add that the dead and wounded had done their duty in service to the Führer and the fatherland. Our gun crew was assigned to perform a security detail, and as dusk fell, we positioned the gun along the road near the battalion defence line. The isolated bursts of impacting mortar rounds echoed over the wheat fields and seemed to chase the sun as it sank slowly in the west toward Germany. Our thoughts followed the sinking, fiery ball penetrating the evening haze to the horizon, and we thought of our homeland whose borders lay 1,500 kilometres behind us. The front refused to sleep at night. Reconnaissance units from both opposing forces remained on the move, slipping through the darkness to locate the enemy positions. Again and again the Russian Maxim fire broke forth through the darkness, always answered by the ripping sound of our Spandau MG-34S, quickly joined by erratic rifle fire. The occasional detonation of hand grenades and the sharp reports of submachine guns drifted across the fields, and for long moments the defensive lines would be illuminated by glowing flares arcing skyward to hang, sizzling, above the line. In the early morning hours we were withdrawn from the sector and deployed 2 kilometres to the south in preparation for another attack. 2 August was marked by a break in the monotonous field rations, when we boiled freshly dug potatoes in an unnamed Ukrainian village. Oberschütze Fair had already plucked a chicken, and together with the boiled hen and potatoes, we ate peeled cucumbers. Several hundred metres along the approach to the village on a small rise was Unteroffizier Einer's burned-out half-track. During the previous day's fighting, he had driven directly into a well-concealed minefield, where the 3 men of the gun crew met their deaths. 2 of the crew members were killed instantly. The anti-tank mine had severed both of Aigner's legs, and he had died that night at the medical collecting point. Their helmets could be seen clustered beneath a birch cross near the destroyed half-track. Their graves added to the mounting casualties the war in the Soviet Union was costing the German army. Not far from their rough gravesite was a row of several dozen wooden box mines dug up by the engineers. The soldiers had long since found an appropriate name for the deadly little boxes, referring to them as Kinderserge. Word passed through the ranks of the infantrymen of how the division chaplain, Satska, had risked his life to recover some of the men who fell wounded before the enemy during the previous day's fighting. We remained ever conscious of how the wounded were treated, as we lived every moment with the reality that we, too, could join them at any time without warning. Many of the soldiers who had not previously been so inclined began to attend religious services, and with the growing consciousness of our own mortality, we became more aware of the presence of the chaplain. As our casualties continued to mount, the chaplain, who wore no insignia of rank in the German army, came to play a more significant role in our lives. For far too many, he would offer the last voice of reassurance and the last vestige of comfort before they, too, succumbed to mortal wounds. Our lines of supply became more strained with each day's advance, and as our momentum slowed to a crawl, we continued to experience ever-increasing sporadic shelling. Once my gas mask and entrenching tool were ripped away by a shell splinter, and my tunic was torn as well, but other than a bruise on my hip, I escaped injury. The Russian rearguard elements continued to withdraw before us, attempting to burn many of the few mud and straw huts in our path, and always leaving an ever-present cadre of snipers, who slowly extracted a deadly price from our ranks at the cost of their own lives. On the 3rd of August, we spent most of the night lying in the middle of a turnip field. At length, a reconnaissance platoon determined that a still intact collective farm, some 500 metres distant, was free of enemy troops, and in the early pre-dawn hours we advanced to the tiny collection of huts. The company kitchen sent forward hot coffee and schmaltzbrot. Our gun crew claimed one of the small thatched roof huts, and we piled straw onto the mud floor and dozed for several hours, thankful that we were not still lying somewhere in the darkness among the turnips. The following day we advanced farther toward the east until our forward reconnaissance units reported having reached the wide Dnieper River. The immense bulk of the Soviet army seemed to have evaporated, and victory appeared all but certain as we neared the banks of the Dnieper. For weeks, our routine had consisted of endless marching, interrupted only by sporadic resistance from small bands of Soviet stragglers overtaken by our advanced units. The occasional enemy dead now attracted little attention, and prisoners became a common sight, always rising from the terrain to approach us cautiously with upraised arms. Most often they would be simply disarmed and motioned toward the rear, often unescorted, to be collected by the reserve column. The evening of the 5th of August found us in recently constructed defensive positions before Velikaya Pritsky. The ominous thunder of heavy shelling continued without pause as our artillery pounded the enemy beyond the horizon. We waited nervously throughout the night for our offensive, which was to begin the next morning. Our attack was launched at precisely 5 o'clock, with the Dnieper as the objective. Our artillery batteries fired smoke and high explosives onto a commanding height designated Hill 197, and from our position we could observe many of the enemy troops fleeing through the clouds of smoke enveloping the terrain features. Prisoners later stated that many of the Soviet troops had fled, panic-stricken, out of fear that we had used poison gas against their stronghold, and indeed sightings of enemy troops donning gas masks during the attack had been reported. Within hours, the ridge was captured by the infantry with minimal losses. At 8 o'clock, the enemy fought a deadly delaying action back to Hill 160, from where they continued to offer dogged resistance from carefully prepared positions. Interrogations of exhausted prisoners indicated that the heavy concentrations of artillery fire were instrumental in draining the will of the defenders. In the late afternoon, our own forces came under attack from squadrons of fighter bombers who inflicted little damage. On the morning of the 7th of August, we laboured to dig defensive positions into the earth near a village called Balika, about 100 metres from the Dnieper. From our position, the wide Dnieper was visible, and we engaged in burrowing into the earth as quickly as possible in anticipation of fighter-bomber attacks, as well as for protection from Soviet gunboats on the river. Within hours, heavy mortar rounds fired from boats maneuvering on the Dnieper began to impact on the slopes near us. A gun from the 1st Platoon attempted to take one of the boats under fire without success, and our positions along the riverbank soon were blanketed with enemy mortar and artillery fire. Despite our extensive preparations, we were forced to withdraw from the positions to avoid suffering casualties inflicted by an enemy beyond our reach. In this sector, we found ourselves facing an enemy who held superiority in heavy weapons, and our own artillery units were now compelled to ration ammunition because of our strained supply lines. The depth of our penetration into the Soviet Union began to take its toll, and ammunition rationing served as a first indication of the shortages that we were to encounter with disastrous results in future battles. The distant thunder of far-off heavy guns resounded faintly in our ears, and was quickly followed by the roar of impacting projectiles echoing over the open terrain. The evening brought more attacks from the Ratas flying low over our positions. Passing over us in what appeared to be no pattern of attack, we attempted to repel them with rifles and light machine guns, with little effect. One evening I observed 2 rations carriers from the artillery battery located behind us, moving along the lower part of the ridge toward the front. The soldier in the lead carried the cylindrical thermos canister in a harness on his back, and they picked their way through the broken ground in the growing twilight, plodding slowly forward over undulating terrain, torn by artillery shells, and made soft and muddy from the intermittent thunderstorms. Suddenly, we were forced once again to dive for cover as a Rata began a surprise descent upon us from a low-hanging cloud bank, and the 2 oncoming figures scrambled for shelter behind the wall of one of the mud huts at the edge of the village. The plane loosed a burst of fire into the village as it passed overhead, before disappearing into the grey thunderheads as quickly as it had appeared. Moments later, the 2 men could again be seen making their way past our position. They picked their way through the morass with difficulty, one following closely behind the other, curses clearly audible in the still air. The second man had slung his carbine and was holding both free hands against the sides of the canister in an attempt to salvage the remaining portion of their day's rations. The steel container had been cleanly punctured by a round from the aircraft's board gun, and the projectile had gone through the sides of the canister, leaving the hot contents pouring in twin streams onto the ground. Dodging the shell craters in the evening twilight, they wound their way through the muddy and torn earth toward the waiting men in the battery position. Still swearing and cursing the Ratas and Ivan, they stumbled slowly forward toward their destination. The soup for the artillery battery was to be carefully rationed that night. But however sparse the quantity, it would still be preferred over the monotonous iron rations of wurst and hard bread we were often compelled to consume while on the march. On the evening of the 9th of August, we were treated to Schweinebraten, brought forward from the field kitchen by couriers, and the following morning we deployed forward again. The enemy had attempted to push armoured units through a sector held by a neighbouring division, and elements of the 68th and our 132 D Infantry Division were ordered to reinforce the sector. The march was ordered for 8 o'clock. In preparation for the move, we were provided with coffee and schmaltzbrot. Despite the sickening odour of a dead horse that permeated the air from the edge of the road, we enjoyed the first meal since being treated to Schweinebraten early in the evening of the previous day. During our short pause, a band of Stukas flew over us, and we were able to observe them break from their formation and dive like hawks on an unseen prey. The screaming aircraft sirens threw panic and confusion throughout the enemy ranks, as the Stukas dropped their bombs into the columns of Russian tanks and troop concentrations hidden from our view behind the terrain features. Clouds of black smoke mushroomed skyward through the still air, marking the locations of the vehicles that had fallen victim to the dive bombers. The Russians soon retaliated with air attacks of their own. Not having had time to prepare defensive positions, we dove for cover in the shallow depressions in the ground, only to be bypassed by the enemy aircraft. Behind us, some bombs fell near a medical collection point without causing casualties. On the 12th of August, our pilots dropped artillery ammunition to the batteries in our rear area. The artillery units had fired ceaselessly while repelling the heavy Soviet counterattacks during the previous days, and the air observers reported that the Soviets were pulling their forces back toward the east over the Dnieper near Kharkiv. Our own units continued to press attacks, but enemy resistance had stiffened and we gained little ground. My gun was situated near a railway embankment to secure the rail lines running toward Kharkiv and over the Dnieper. The front in our sector had remained quiet throughout the afternoon, and Hartmann and I set out on a short reconnaissance of our area. Behind the rail line, in an easterly direction along the edge of a small grove of trees, we suddenly found ourselves staring into the muzzle of a Maxim machine gun, not 10 meters distant. Concealed beneath the shadows of low-lying branches, a blood-soaked figure in a khaki uniform was draped motionless over the gun carriage, as if resting. Quietly releasing the safety catches of our submachine guns, we gingerly edged forward, surveying the scene before us. Lying closely together in a jagged row along the railway embankment, we found a group of about 30 dead Russians. From their position, it was obvious that during the previous day's fighting, a burst from a tank or aircraft machine gun had caught the platoon in a flanking fire, killing or wounding all of them instantly. I slowly slipped forward to examine one of the casualties, and observed that the lifeless hand of one of the corpses still grasped an open package containing a field bandage. The badly wounded Russian had vainly attempted to bandage himself, but unable to staunch the flow of blood, had slowly died where he lay. His tunic was unbuttoned to the waist, his uniform black with the encrusted blood from a fatal wound. My gaze wandered from the first figure and fell upon a corpse wearing the uniform of a sergeant. The NCO was grasping one of the wheels of the Maxim carriage, his sightless eyes peering forward at the ammunition belt where it fed into the chamber of the weapon. Another held his rifle clenched in cold fists, his head resting against the ground as if asleep, the olive-coloured helmet secured tightly under his chin. Hartmann slipped past me and slowly approached two other figures lying closely together, side by side. One of the figures had draped an arm across the other in a last embrace, as if attempting to comfort a dying comrade. As Hartmann neared, a cloud of flies rose in protest, breaking the deathly silence, and I moved forward to join him in surveying the ghastly scene. Moving silently among the carnage, Hartmann suddenly turned and slipped past me without speaking, heading in the direction from which we had come. Carefully avoiding the eyes of the dead, I quickly followed him. In this abode of death, only the trees, still and quiet, appeared to be survivors and witnesses to the struggle that had occurred, hidden within this wooded glade. Despite having observed death many times over the past months, I unknowingly remained a novice as yet to the true brutality and horror of war. I could never at the time have imagined that in the months and years to come I would become benumbed to death on the battlefield, and that such scenes would be commonplace to us all. In the months to come, our reaction to the deaths we had witnessed would become callous and accepting. We would have searched the corpses for documents, collected weapons, and gathered equipment for our own use. At this early stage during our baptism of war, we remained burdened by the naive thoughts of pity for the dead, and by our own aversion to physical contact with the bloody and torn bodies strewn upon the earth where they had fallen. On the 13th of August, we occupied a former Russian field position approximately 10 kilometers northwest of the city of Kharkiv on the Dnieper. We had taken over the holes hacked into the clay by the enemy, who had occupied the heights only a few days previously. Experts at digging and camouflaging positions in the open fields, the Russians had constructed earthworks that consisted of circular holes about waist deep, widened at the bottom to allow one to lie comfortably with enough room to stretch the legs. The clay held fast and was excellent for tunnelling, so I confidently improved my position with my entrenching tool. Prior to our attack, a rather small Russian must have occupied it. I found the cool earth of my new dwelling comfortable, despite the sultriness of the hot Ukrainian summer day. Here I felt secure, with a sense that nothing could happen to me quickly or without warning. We crept cautiously forward into the open terrain to gather grass and straw, with which we camouflaged our anti-tank gun. In the evening twilight, someone brought in a large bundle of straw, which was divided among the gun crews. With this, we could plan on spending a comfortable night, providing that Ivan did not wake us. The evening shadows disappeared as twilight turned to darkness, leaving rugged silhouettes of the uneven hills and deep ravines, the Balkas, to the east of us across the Dnieper. We would come to know them well in the future fighting. The enemy had re-established defensive positions approximately 300 meters from our location in a small wood. To the left began a small valley lined with birch trees and heavy undergrowth that would have left an impression of peaceful solitude if not for the occasional Maxim bursts that broke forth to harass our positions from this direction. We left one man on guard huddled behind the heavy armor shield of the pack for protection from stray machine gun and sniper rounds, and the sentry was relieved hourly while we spent the night within our straw-lined holes. It is the nature of war to strike unexpectedly. A soldier may be temporarily lulled into a rare moment of false security, huddled in a crude shelter next to a warming fire during a cold night or sleeping soundly while curled up in a foxhole, only to be immediately thrust into an unforgiving and violent situation. Once again we were aroused from our rest by two rations carriers, who appeared from the darkness bringing the unwelcome news that we were again to shift positions and make preparations for another attack in the morning. With the now familiar coldness lying in the depths of our stomachs, we departed our comfortable foxholes shortly before midnight, and were soon labouring under a star-filled sky to complete new positions farther to the right before daybreak. The occasional muffled clanging of entrenching tools was clearly audible to the enemy as we worked, and flares sizzled skyward through the night from the edge of a nearby wood. Time and again it was necessary to throw ourselves flat on the ground and lie motionless to protect ourselves from the Maxim fire probing our positions, the bullets popping through the air overhead, and tracers leaving orange-red streaks arching and bouncing through the darkness. During the early morning hours we received reinforcements in the form of two self-propelled guns, which rumbled up to our position on heavy tracks. Our initial concerns were that their throbbing Maybach engines would attract unwanted attention to our position. Despite our fears, their presence failed to attract more machine gun fire, as the Russians were probably unwilling to reveal their locations to the armoured vehicles. Our attack took place at 15 o'clock on the 14th of August. Following a 10-minute mortar barrage on the woods, the forward assault elements had closed in to within 100 metres from the tree line, when a Russian tank concealed on our left flank opened fire. It was spotted by one of the supporting self-propelled guns, and following a brief exchange of fire, the Russian tank was left burning. Our heavy machine guns and mortars opened fire on the tree line in attempts to eliminate the ever-present enemy snipers, and we joined them in firing anti-personnel rounds into the treetops with our pack. With the destruction of the enemy tank, our attack pushed farther forward through the wooded area, and despite our concern the previous evening, it was now comforting to have the support of the heavy assault guns. We were able to determine the location of the destroyed tank from the black cloud of smoke rising from the burning turret, and we heard rumours that one of the companies had suffered a number of casualties from the heavily armoured vehicle before it had been located and destroyed. We were facing the last obstacle defending Kanev. Although we had reached our assigned objective, we were again ordered forward after receiving reinforcements. Our assault resumed at 18 o'clock. Our limbered gun was bouncing behind the tractor toward the city, following in the wake of the infantry assault company, when we suddenly came under flanking fire from an enemy field position. Having lain hidden to be bypassed by our advanced elements, the enemy now attacked the platoon with small arms fire that impacted against the thin skin of the tractor and snapped through the air above us. At that moment, the Chenilette motor stalled, and the vehicle lurched to a halt under a hail of fire. With pounding hearts, we grasped submachine guns and carbines and desperately scrambled for cover, the realization that we were caught on open ground gripping us with fear. Our machine gunner, Robert, with whom I had served since recruit training, seized his MG-34 and sprang to his feet to lunge forward under the weight of the machine gun. He sprinted toward the muzzle flashes, revealing the enemy position, firing streams of bullets from the hip as he ran. Completely surprised by this assault, a number of the Russians rose from their positions and stumbled toward us, arms raised in surrender. We were able to catch a further glimpse of Robert before he disappeared into the undulating terrain, firing bursts into knots of Soviets who continued to offer resistance. We rapidly unlimbered the pack and prepared the gun for action. However, no longer knowing Robert's position, we were forced to hold our fire. With submachine guns and rifles at the ready, we advanced to a small rise, and at the crest we found Robert lying over his MG with a single bullet wound through the heart. The bullet had exited through his back, and from this wound ran a crimson stream of blood. Hartmann knelt alongside the inert form and confirmed that he was dead, rolling him carefully onto his back. Reaching for the linen string from which hung every soldier's identity tag, Hartmann broke the metal tag in two at the perforation before unbuttoning Robert's tunic to remove his identity book and watch. We gazed into questioning eyes staring skyward in the dusk, and the shock on his face seemed as to ask, "Why must I die now? Why?" Darkness descended on us as we carried the body back to our position. The experiences of the past weeks now seemed to consume my thoughts, and I pictured the graves left by the roadsides behind us. For the first time in my memory as an adult, I wept at the loss of an especially close friend. The following day, the company commander wrote letters to the relatives of 5 men who had fallen during our most recent encounters with the Soviet army. On the 17th of August, shallow caves dug into a Balka offered us protection from the fighter-bomber attacks. We had reached the heights of the west bank of the Dnieper, and now we found ourselves under erratic shell fire from Soviet artillery positions, concealed on the east bank of the river. To the southeast of us was the city of Kanev, and a railway bridge led toward the east over the river. With the capture of this line, we had seized the last avenue of overland retreat for the Russians who had been attempting to withdraw farther east during the previous night, and in the early morning hours, isolated groups of enemy soldiers set out in boats to attempt an escape. Sporadic small arms fire could be heard throughout the night as fleeing Russians came under fire from probing reconnaissance units. Immense quantities of equipment and vehicles, including many American Ford trucks, had fallen into our hands. Hidden near the Balka, we found 2 abandoned but completely intact T-34 tanks that were battle-ready with fully loaded ammunition racks. We climbed into the tanks in a vain search for anything of use to us. For several days I had been plagued with acute diarrhea, and I soon found myself incapacitated with a blinding headache accompanied by dizziness and severe stomach cramps. I soon developed a fever, and assisted by some of the lightly wounded, I was ordered to the medical aid station in the rear. En route, we passed through the battlefield of the previous day, and the small depressions lined with bushes and birch trees appeared peaceful to our burning eyes, showing little evidence of the traumatic events that had occurred there. With the exception of isolated bomb craters and occasional scars from shell splinters, little trace of the war that had consumed this land was visible. At the foot of an extended slope, we passed 3 rough-hewn birch crosses garnished with bits of greenery and wildflowers. Under the surface of the freshly turned soil rested my good friend Robert, wrapped in a shelter quarter, sharing a ragged birch cross with his fallen comrades, his battered grey-green helmet perched on the cross to mark his place among the dead. My thoughts quickly left the graves as the painful throbbing behind my eyes increased, and in a feverish delirium we stumbled through our advanced positions abandoned 3 days ago. The burned-out tank provided us with a good reference point. Approximately 100 metres farther, we encountered a staggering figure with swinging arms and swaying body. The apparition was clearly attempting to follow a straight course, and 2 of us unslung our carbines and approached close enough to recognize a bloodied Russian army uniform beneath the layers of dust and dirt. His gymnasioka was hanging beltless from his body. I approached him and seized his upper arm, looking into the parchment-like face of an approximately 28-year-old soldier. The thin face stared back at me, wide-eyed and unblinking. The eyes of the insane, I thought to myself. From the encrusted blood on his neck and torso, I was able to determine that he had received a severe head wound, as grey brain matter protruded from a closely cropped skull. A cloud of flies swarmed about the wound caked with black-red blood, and it was obvious that a bullet or shell fragment had ripped part of his skull away some days previously. He must have been lying unconscious in the undergrowth until shortly before our arrival. Two of us grasped him by the shoulders and led him with us toward the aid station, attempting to support him as he stumbled forward, unable to regain his balance. Through a haze of pain, I became conscious of a horse-drawn battery that halted alongside us in a cloud of dust, and a number of lancers assisted us in climbing aboard the caissons. They offered us water from field flasks, and the soldier in Russian khaki wedged tightly between us began to stammer. Through the croaking of his voice, I could understand "Woti," water. Exhausted, we reached the medical station, and from behind a feverish veil, I observed how the wounded who had accompanied me were tended, and the Russian soldier's head was bandaged. I was given a number of tablets, and the medical officer reported that a thermometer revealed a temperature of 39.8 degrees Celsius. I was then given warm tea in a field cup, and a medical orderly led me to a straw bed in a former schoolhouse. I did not awaken before the afternoon of the following day, after having slept 18 hours straight. Feeling fresh and wide awake, I was provided a meal consisting of a healthy portion of bean soup and heavy black bread, which I consumed ravenously. Looking around, I was surprised to see that the area was almost deserted. The wounded occupants of the aid station were no longer present. They had either been evacuated or had been diagnosed as fit enough to be returned to their units, and only a small number of ill soldiers remained at the station, attended by the young medical orderly who had assisted me upon my arrival. He advised me that during the early morning hours the seriously wounded had been transported, and that a medical officer had attempted to awaken me without success. The following morning my fever was gone, and I was directed to return to my company. After a journey on a series of trucks and in pony carts, I managed to locate my gun crew, who, during my absence, had again been sent back into action against enemy units that had temporarily broken through near Karniev. This is part 1 of the Memoirs of a Wehrmacht soldier. The continuation of this story will be posted soon. I kindly ask you to subscribe to this channel because your support motivates me to create more videos featuring the valuable memories of soldiers that deserve to be heard. When we reach 10,000 subscribers, I will release a special video as a token of appreciation for your support. Feel free to share your thoughts, memories, or opinions on this story in the comments section.